Chapter 9: Fresh Blood. In the days when the eastern corruption crept ever westward and the wizard Fenris kept his watch, the first cold of winter was settling into the high peaks. He had spent the day walking the ridgeline east of the Great Lake, measuring the flows of the land's hidden currents, marking the places where the old boundary showed strain. It was slow work, requiring stillness of mind and an eye for changes so gradual that other men would not see them at all. The seals held, as they had held. He turned for home as the light failed, the mountains darkening behind him, the lake spreading black and cold below. In the tower's narrow windows, a faint glow. He found a sheltering rock on the mountainside and, with a simple gesture, had a fire going. Soon the crackle of burning wood and the low sound of his kettle were the only sounds. He was a man of simple pleasures when his work allowed. A cup of warm tea was chief among them. He was pouring the first cup when a small shift in the land's rhythm registered in his mind. It was not the magic of the earth itself, but the faint, subtle energy of another living being, young, frightened, desperate. He paused, his hand steady on the kettle, and slowly poured a second cup. He knew without looking that he was not alone. Not far off, hidden in the shadows cast by the rocks, a young person watched. Her name was Lyra, though none now living save herself knew it. She was dressed as a boy, her face streaked with dirt and hunger, her eyes hard with the caution of one who had learned survival in the cruelest school. Her family had been lost to fire when she was 10 winters old. Her father kept a workshop at the edge of a market town, a merchant of moderate success, careful with coin, not a man who drew trouble. The fire came in the night. She had been sleeping in the yard on a hot summer's evening and woke to the sound of it. She did not go back in. She stood in the yard and watched, and when it was over, her father and mother and the youngest child were gone, and she was not, and she had no explanation for any of it. A traveling troupe had taken her in when she was 12 or 13. She had been useful, had learned to throw knives from her father who kept them for his trade, and the troupe found uses for a child who could perform and ask for little. She learned the rest in 6 or 7 years. The acrobatics, the low voice, the boys' clothes, the art of moving through a crowd without being remembered. She had been with them 8 years. The troupe master had arranged her to one of the other performers, a handler of the trick animals, a man not unkind exactly, simply indifferent. It was a reasonable arrangement by the master's reckoning. An unmarried woman of 20 with no family was a source of complications, suspicious to village authorities, a liability on the road. She knew this. She had watched the other women in the troupe who had been arranged, and she had done the arithmetic on what her life would look like in 2 years, in 5. The troupe had dissolved 3 nights past, not from any single cause but from the accumulated weight of a bad season. Debts. Poor audiences in a string of failing villages. The master losing his authority over the group in a single evening, an argument that turned to blows, then to departure, then to more departures, until by morning there was no troupe left to speak of. Lyra had taken her roll of knives and her rucksack and left in the confusion, not toward anywhere, away. Now she was starving, exhausted, and lost in the high peaks as winter's teeth began to bite. She had been watching the wizard for perhaps 20 minutes, trying to assess whether he was a threat or an opportunity, looking for any sign of danger, any hint that approaching him would mean her death rather than salvation. His calm, almost casual movements as he made his tea had made her reconsider her initial plan to simply steal food and vanish. There was something in his bearing, a quietness, a lack of threat that spoke of safety. But she had been fooled before. The world was full of men who seemed kind until they weren't. Before she could decide whether to show herself or slip away into the darkness, the wizard spoke aloud into the night, his voice calm and clear with no hint of surprise. "The tea is ready," he said. "Come join me at the fire." The invitation. A silent gasp escaped her lips, a betraying breath of cold air that misted in the mountain chill. She froze like a hunted deer, every muscle in her body screaming to run. How? How could he have known? She was a ghost upon the wind, a whisper in the forest. Her family and the troop had taught her well the art of moving unseen. But this man, this peculiar, unthreatening figure, had known she was there all along. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and desperation. The part of her that had been trained by years of living upon the road screamed at her to flee, to vanish back into the darkness. She was a survivor, and survivors did not take chances with strangers. Trust was what got you killed. But her body, a hollow drum of hunger and exhaustion, protested. Her stomach ached with a constant, gnawing emptiness that had become her only companion. She could not remember her last full meal, could not remember a time when she felt truly warm. The Bard troop had been a refuge, but even they had fed her only enough to keep her working. Now she was alone, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the wind that she could not survive another week in these mountains. She would starve, or freeze, or both. She watched him from the shadows, her heart thrumming against her ribs like a caged bird. He did not look at her hiding place. He simply sat there by his fire, a calm island in a chaotic sea. With slow, deliberate movements, a show of trust, she realized he reached into his leather bag and took out a loaf of dark bread and a wedge of pale cheese. Her mouth watered painfully, an automatic response to the sight of food. Then he spoke again, his voice echoing in the stillness. "I have some bread and cheese," he said, the words clear and gentle, not a sound of threat in them. "It would be bloody impolite of me to eat alone when I know another soul is hungry nearby." That was what broke her. The politeness. The simple, kind assumption of shared humanity in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty and indifference for 6 years. It was not a trick, or if it was the most elaborate trap she had ever seen. It was an invitation. A genuine invitation to sit by a fire, to eat bread and cheese, to be a person again instead of a ghost. She had run the calculation, already had been running it for days, turning it the way she turned a thrown knife before deciding whether to use it. The nearest village lay 2 days west at best. She knew what waited there for a girl traveling alone with no kin and no name, questions she could not answer, a household that might take her in or might not, and the distance between those two outcomes was thinner than people said. Taken in meant labor, obligation, someone else's authority over her movements and her time. Turned away meant the road again with winter closing. She had seen what happened to girls without family in villages that had no use for them. She had been one, briefly, before the troop found her. The larger towns further on were the same arithmetic with more eyes watching. The Bard troop was scattered. She had spent 6 years attaching herself to other people's purposes, and each one had ended the same way, alone again, the door closing, moving on. She was not looking for safety. She had stopped believing in safety some years back. What she was doing was choosing which kind of danger was least known. This man by a fire was the one she had not tried. She did not know what he would do with her. She did not expect kindness, she had no grounds for it. But she knew what the others would do, the villages and the households and the groups of travelers, because she had learned that already at some cost. The unknown was worse in every way except one: she had not yet ruled it out. She was also tired. Tired of the cold, tired of the low, constant hum of fear that had been her companion for 6 years. But it was not the exhaustion that moved her. What moved her was the arithmetic. Her caution still screamed. She stepped from the shadows anyway. Slowly, her muscles aching with cold and tension, she began to move. She stepped from the deep shadows and into the flickering light of the fire, her feet moving as silently as she could make them on the rocky ground. Her eyes never left his face, watching for any sign of danger, any hint that this was a mistake. But he only smiled, a gentle thing, without malice, and extended a warm cup of tea toward her. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and deep. "My name is Fenris." The fire. Lyra's hand trembled as she took the cup, not from the cold alone, but from the raw, exposed feeling of being truly seen. She realized with a start that it had been months since anyone had looked at her as a person rather than as a useful tool or a potential victim. He gestured to a flat stone near the fire. "Sit yourself down. I shall slice some cheese." She should have run. Every instinct honed by 6 years of flight and desperation screamed at her to flee. But the voice in her head that had been screaming for so long was exhausted now. The fear that had kept her alive had become a dead weight. She was so tired of fighting the world. She was tired of the cold, tired of the gnawing hunger, tired of waking each morning uncertain if she would see another sunset. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that this was the end of her road one way or another. Whether he was a good man or a monster, the outcome felt the same. Her fight was over. She could no longer sustain it. And if this was a surrender, at least it was a surrender that came with the promise of warmth and a full belly. She would rather die warm and fed than cold and alone. It was a stupid, foolish choice perhaps, but it was the only choice she had left. She sat. She watched as Fenris moved with quiet, deliberate grace. He took the dark loaf from his bag and the round of cheese. He produced a knife, not a weapon, but a tool, its blade surprisingly sharp and well maintained. It made no sound as he sliced the loaf into even, thick pieces. From a small pouch tied to his belt, he took a pinch of dark, fragrant powder and sprinkled it over the bread and cheese with the care of a craftsman. "It would be a pity to eat such simple fare without a little flavor," he commented, his voice as calm as the fire's crackle. "A bit of ground thyme and star anise makes the bread sweeter and the cheese richer. And a touch of smoked salt, of course, to bring out the fire in the taste. It's all about finding the right balance between the earth and the spice." He pushed a small wooden plate toward her, the bread and cheese transformed by his careful attention into something that looked almost like a feast. Lyra, her hunger a desperate claw in her stomach, took a piece and bit into it. The flavors exploded in her mouth, simple ingredients made complex by his knowledge. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down, and the trembling of her hands was replaced by the simple comfort of being still. The fire crackled between them. The only other sound was the quiet rhythm of Fenris chewing his bread, seeming perfectly content with the silence. He was a master of stillness. Lyra realized, comfortable in it in a way that spoke of long practice. As her hunger began to abate, she found her tension slowly dissolving into the warmth. He seemed to sense her easing and, without looking directly at her, began to speak in a low, steady rumble. "I was doing some measurements today," he said, taking a sip of his tea. "Traveling along the mountain range. The magic fields are curious this time of year, a little thinner than I would prefer, a little brittle, like ice upon a spring pond." He was speaking of things she did not understand, but the calm cadence of his voice was soothing. He was simply talking about his day, like a farmer might talk about the weather or a smith about his tools. There seemed to be no malice in him, only a gentle strangeness. "I saw a great bull moose today," he continued, his gaze drifting toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "A mighty beast. He was drinking from a half-frozen stream. His antlers were so large they looked like two ancient, tangled trees growing from his head. He saw me not, of course, but I felt him, felt the magic in his hide and bones." Fenris paused, and Lyra found herself leaning forward despite herself, drawn in like a child listening to a story. "He was an old bull," Fenris explained, "and the magic within him, in his very essence, was as old as these mountains themselves. I could feel the cold of every winter he had seen, the heat of every summer, every storm he had weathered. The magic was a living history, a record of every moment of his life written in his flesh and spirit. He was not just an animal, he was a force of nature, a part of the land itself. I watched him drink until he was satisfied, and then he simply faded back into the trees, leaving no sound behind him." He smiled slightly. The land speaks, if you know how to listen. Every rock, every tree, every creature, they all have their own voice, their own story. Most folk walk through the world deaf and blind to it. But it's there, all around us, singing its ancient songs. Lyra sat in the silence that followed, her fear completely gone now, replaced by a kind of wonder she had not felt since before her family died. The world Fenris described was a place of magic and beauty, not merely bandits and hunger and cold. It was a world she had forgotten could exist. She finished the last of the cheese, the warmth of the tea settling deep in her bones like a blessing. The simple, civilized act of eating and drinking with another person jolted her from her weary days. She remembered her manners, or rather, she remembered that she had forgotten them. She had not given greeting, had not offered her name, had not thanked him for his kindness. Shame washed over her. She was not a beast. She was a person, and people had courtesy. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. What should she say? What should she reveal, and what should she hide? Her survival training kicked in like a reflex. She would not give her true name. Lyra was her mother's name, a sacred thing, the last connection to her lost family. She would not reveal that she was a girl the world was too dangerous for that truth. She would give him the story she used on the road with strangers. "Good evening," she said, her voice a little hoarse from disuse and cold. "My name is Leo. I thank you for your kindness, Goodman. I am a traveler. I was with a bard troupe." She left out that she was an acrobat and knife thrower. Those were skills, weapons she did not want him to know she possessed. She had to give him just enough to be plausible, just enough to seem harmless. As she spoke, she became acutely aware of the necklace around her neck, her mother's necklace, a simple silver amulet on a chain. It had been cold against her skin for as long as she could remember, a dead thing kept only for memory's sake. But now, as she spoke her lies to the wizard, it began to feel warm. The warmth spread across her chest, a gentle heat that was utterly impossible. The amulet had never done this before. Never. It was just a piece of metal, an heirloom with no power save sentiment. She finished her sentence, her eyes going wide with confusion and a touch of fear. What was happening? "Leo, do you like this name?" Fenris asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. It was not an accusation. It was a simple, curious question, but it landed like a hammer blow. He knew. He knew the name was a lie. He knew without being told, and he showed no surprise, no anger, only a quiet, unnerving curiosity that suggested he understood far more than he was saying. He did not wait for her answer, his gaze calm and even friendly as he continued. "A bard troupe, you say? You were a part of it, aye? What did you do in the group? Do you sing? You have a pleasing voice." The questions were simple, but they were also a trap. He was peeling back the layers of her lie with the gentleness of a healer removing a bandage. Lyra, her mind racing, knew she couldn't admit to lying about her name outright, but she also couldn't say nothing. Her survival instincts, dulled by exhaustion, fled to life again. "It's a good name," she said, her voice a little too firm, avoiding the question of whether she liked it. "I was with them, I was an acrobat," she admitted, giving a half-truth that felt less threatening than the full one. Then she added a lie, "I did sing as well. I can sing." She didn't know why she had said it. It was a clumsy lie, but it was a desperate attempt to appear more harmless, more like a boy from a bard troupe, and less like a girl who knew how to kill with thrown knives. "Oh, that is so very pleasant," Fenris said, his eyes crinkling at the corners with what seemed genuine joy. He was not smiling in a way that seemed to mock her, but with a quiet, honest pleasure. "Would you care to sing me a song? I would very much enjoy hearing one." The request landed like a stone in her chest. A song. She had not sung a note since her mother died. The lie, her clumsy, desperate lie, had come to life and was now strangling her. Her mind raced frantically. What could she say? The troupe had a specific set of songs they performed, but she didn't know the words well enough to carry a full verse. She could claim she was too tired, but he would see through that. She was caught, trapped by her own mouth. Then a sudden, sharp heat seared through her tunic. The necklace, the amulet from her mother, was burning against her skin, hot as a brand fresh from the forge. She gasped aloud, a small, choked sound of pain and confusion. What in all the hells was happening? As she struggled for a response, her eyes wide with panic, Fenris calmly reached over and refilled her cup from the kettle. A simple act, gentle and unhurried, that felt monumental in her moment of crisis. He set the kettle down, leaned toward her slightly, and his gaze no longer distant, fixed on her face with quiet intensity. "Are you well?" he asked softly, genuine concern in the question. Lyra's breath hitched. She could say nothing. The lie was gone, shattered. The fear was real and present. The heat of the amulet was a physical, impossible thing burning her flesh, and she had no words for any of it. She simply stared at Fenris, her eyes wide as a cornered animal's, her silence a full and complete admission of her terror. Fenris did not move suddenly or speak harshly. He watched her for a long, silent moment, assessing, understanding. Then, with slow, deliberate motion, he reached out and placed one large, calloused hand directly upon her chest, over the burning amulet. The searing heat vanished instantly, replaced by a cool, spreading calm that radiated from his palm like water poured upon fire. The impossible sensation was gone, leaving only the memory of warmth and a profound sense of relief that made her want to weep. He pulled his hand back, and the tension that had filled the air evaporated like morning mist. Without a word, he dug into a small pouch at his waist and pulled out a handful of dried berries and nuts, pushing them toward her upon the wooden plate. "Here," he said, his voice as calm as a still lake. "These are a little sweeter than the cheese. They are good for the heart and for steadying the nerves." Lyra took the food with trembling hands. The silence that fell between them was no longer frightening. It was filled instead with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. She had chosen silence over lies, and in return, he had given her peace. The amulet's story. Fenris calmly changed the subject, talking about simple, everyday things he knew would ground her. He spoke of the best way to dry wild apples for winter storage, about which herbs held their flavor best after being preserved, about how to tell a good mushroom from a poisonous one by the color of its gills. He gave her space to recover, to understand that he was not a threat despite knowing her secrets. As she listened, eating the nuts and berries with hands that slowly stopped shaking, her heart began to settle back into a normal rhythm. The conversation was so ordinary, so far removed from the magic that had just occurred, that it was a profound comfort in itself. Fenris watched her carefully, a new, thoughtful expression upon his weathered face. He was an expert in the hidden magic of the world, and he knew raw talent when he encountered it. He had felt the pulse of latent power within this girl, for girl she clearly was, despite the boy's clothes and the false name. A force of nature as quiet and untamed as the moose he had seen. The amulet, that simple silver charm, was an amplifier rather than a source. It was a tool that had lain dormant until it sensed its owner's true potential awakening in the presence of another wielder of power. It was either mere coincidence, a miraculous stroke of fate, or a sign that there was something more to this girl's story than simple survival. He suspected the latter. After a long pause, his voice soft and careful, he asked, "What is the nature of that amulet? And what is the story behind it?" Lyra froze, her hand going instinctively to clutch the cool metal against her chest. It was the only thing she had left from her mother. It was a physical connection to a life that had been violently taken from her. The thought of telling this stranger, this man she had met mere hours ago, was terrifying. But the trust he had so carefully built, the simple kindness he had shown, compelled her to speak. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. It was my mother's, she said, her eyes fixed on the fire, a single tear tracing a path down her dirty cheek. It's the only thing that remains of her. The words opened a floodgate in her mind. Her mother. What did she truly know of her mother? Her father's side of the family had been merchants and accountants, a long line of practical folk who dealt in coin and ledgers. There was nothing magical in that lineage. But her mother. She realized with a start that she knew so little of her mother's past. Only that she had come from a distant village near a forest, some days' journey to the east. She had never asked, and her mother had never spoken of it. Lyra's mind, tired and starved of thought for so long, began to sift through old memories like a miser counting coins. They were small, insignificant details that had seemed normal at the time but now glowed with new meaning. Her mother had a way with plants. Her small garden behind the shop was always the first to bloom, even in the harshest spring. Her mother would mend Lyra's clothes with a strange, silvery thread that never seemed to break, no matter how roughly the garment was used. And when Lyra was sick with fever, her mother would sing a certain lullaby that was not like the others. It was a series of low hums that seemed to resonate in the bones, and the pain would simply fade away. These were things she had long dismissed as a mother's love and skill. Now, sitting in the mountains with a man who could cool a burning amulet with a touch, they felt like clues to a mystery she had never known existed. My father was a merchant, she said slowly, looking up at Fenris, her voice hesitant. My family, they were just normal folk, common as dirt. But my mother, she recounted the details, the blooming garden, the unbreakable thread, the healing songs. I always thought it was just her way, she finished, her voice trailing off. But what if it was not? What if there was something more to her? Fenris was silent for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. We shall have to ponder this more deeply, he murmured, his gaze falling from her face to the flames. But not tonight. Tonight, you are exhausted and half frozen. The tone of the conversation shifted, moving from mysteries of the past to practicalities of the present. He began to pack the remaining bread and cheese into his pouch with efficient movements. It's too cold to sleep outside this night, he said simply. We might even see snow before dawn. He did not look at her as he spoke. I have a dwelling of sorts, about an hour's walk from here. I can offer you a bed by the fireplace, warm and safe. We can speak more of your mother tomorrow, when minds are clearer. He paused, giving her a moment to absorb the offer. You will not survive a cold night out here alone. Of that I am certain. The choice. Lyra's breath hitched in her throat. A house. A dwelling. Alone with a man she had just met, a man who had already seen through her lies, who knew she was not what she claimed to be. Her body, tired as it was, screamed at her to refuse. She had relied on her low voice and her boy's clothes to keep her safe for 6 years. It had worked thus far, but with him, she felt as if he could see right through her disguise, down to the truth she desperately tried to hide. Fenris seemed to sense her hesitation. He looked at her then, his gaze calm and unwavering as stone. My home is not a threat to you, he said, his voice as steady as the mountains themselves. It is a sanctuary. I ask for no favor in return, no payment, no debt. Just a safe place to rest your head until morning. It was a danger, an impossible, stupid risk. Her instincts honed by 6 years of hiding and running, of sleeping with one eye open and a knife in her hand, screamed at her to refuse, to take her tea and her full belly and vanish back into the darkness where she belonged. She was a ghost. Ghosts had no homes. Ghosts did not trust. But what were her true options? 2 nights ago, before the troop had finally broken apart, it had been impossibly cold sleeping even in a wagon buried under a pile of blankets. This far up in the mountains, with snow threatening and the wind like knives, she wouldn't last the night. Her bones already ached with a deep, consuming cold that no campfire could fully banish. She she would meet her end out there, cold, miserable death alone in the dark, her body not found until spring thaw if ever. She was frightened. A deep bone-shaking fear coiled in her stomach like a serpent. The world was not kind, she knew that better than most. It had taken her parents without warning, without mercy. The troop, the people who had given her a place, had scattered and left her behind when danger came. Trust was a fool's game, a lie people told to make you lower your guard so they could hurt you more easily. But this man, he was not like the others she had known. He did not demand. He did not threaten or posture. He simply was. He saw her, truly saw her, through all her lies and disguises, and he offered her warmth. He heard her clumsy falsehoods, and he did not punish her for them. He felt her fear, and he simply offered sanctuary. His hands, so strong and strange when they touched her burning amulet, had been gentle. The world she knew was a world of sharp edges and cold indifference, but he seemed a contradiction to all of that, a quiet calm in the endless storm. The necklace, cold as a stone for all her life until this night, was now pulsing with a steady, quiet warmth against her skin, a tiny, impossible heartbeat that seemed to reassure her, to whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, the world might hold one or two miracles after all. She did not have the strength to fight for her survival anymore, to run from yet another potential monster, but she was too tired to die alone in the cold. She would risk the monster for one more night of warmth, one more morning of waking to see the sun. She swallowed, the dryness in her throat making her voice crack. She whispered, the single word a complete surrender to fate. I will go with you. The journey to the tower. Lyra went back for her rucksack, a worn leather bag stuffed with the last of her belongings. It was a small piece of her old life she clung to with fierce, quiet desperation. She had hidden it when she had slipped away to scout and steal, and now she slung it over her shoulder as they began to walk. They moved south along the mountain range, following a path that was barely visible in the darkness. The air grew still as they descended, the biting wind from the high peaks giving way to a strange, heavy quiet that felt almost oppressive. She noticed the nature around them subtly changing as they walked. The rough, scraggly pines of the high country gave way to old, gnarled willows that twisted together overhead, their branches forming an arched tunnel through which they passed. It was surreal, a world unto itself, separate from the harsh mountains above. Then, perhaps 10 minutes later, the sounds changed again. She heard a low, rhythmic roar like distant thunder that would not cease, the sound of waves crashing against stone. But they were in the mountains. How could there be waves? The Great Lake, Fenris said without her asking, as though reading her confusion. We are nearly there. The path led them out onto a small plateau that jutted from the mountainside like a stone finger pointing into darkness. From this high vantage, the valleys on either side looked like great, dark fjords thick with trees and shadow. At the end of the plateau, a narrow stone bridge stretched across a chasm. Its wooden railings looked fresh, recently installed, the only new thing in this ancient landscape. The bridge led to a tiny island that stood high above the churning water below. And there, tucked behind an impossibly old, sprawling tree whose branches reached like grasping hands toward the sky, stood a tower. It was 3 stories high and built of dark stone that seemed to drink in what little moonlight reached this place. There were no lights in its narrow windows. It looked ancient, older than the kingdoms, older perhaps than the memory of men. But a small gate at its base, more a door than a proper gate, fashioned with thick wooden panels and decorated with metal ornaments that gleamed dully, looked as though it could withstand a siege. A tiny, faint light glowed from behind 2 small windows flanking the gate, and Lyra could just make out intricate patterns of colored glass. That is my dwelling, Fenris said casually, as though he were pointing out his neighbor's cottage rather than this impossible structure. And in that moment, it struck her like a blow to the chest. He was no peasant. His hands, though calloused, were not the hands of a common laborer. He was no lord, he had no retainers, no keep, no need for the formal trappings of power. He was no clerk from the temple with their robes and chants and holy books. He was something else entirely, a category unto himself. What in all the hells was he? The Tower. The world she knew was a rigid structure, a society built upon titles and roles that everyone understood. A man was a lord, a farmer, a knight, or a temple keeper. You knew how to speak to them, how to interact with them, how to gauge the danger they represented. But Fenris fit no mold she recognized. He was an anomaly, a strange, unplaceable man who defied every rule she had learned. To what structure could she assign him? The very thought made her head ache. Her mind was a storm of confusion, a desperate, frantic search for a box to put this man in so she could understand him, predict him, survive him. She marveled at the impossible beauty of the place as they crossed the narrow bridge, the willows like a living sculpture, the sound of waves in the mountains, the tiny island with its ancient sentinel tree. It was a place that defied all logic, and it fit him perfectly. This was his world, and she was an intruder with no map to guide her. She studied him as he walked ahead of her, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place only to shatter just as quickly when examined. He carried a strange walking stick, a simple branch marked with carvings and symbols she had never seen before. It seemed to have some other purpose beyond mere support, to be a tool or a focus of some kind. His coat was heavy and thick, unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a strange mix between a traveling coat and a ceremonial cloak, with a hood that could serve as both protection from weather and something like a ritual hat. It was not the simple wool of a peasant, nor the fine linen of a lord, nor the solemn robes of a temple keeper. She tried desperately to make sense of it. Perhaps he was a lord of some kind? But what manner of lord lived alone in a tower with no servants, no retainers, no concern for power or politics? He spoke of measuring the land's magic, not of collecting taxes or raising armies. Perhaps he was a holy man? He had that quiet, otherworldly presence. But his clothing belonged to no religion she recognized, and he spoke of magic in the earth rather than prayers to the gods. A hermit, then? But hermits lived in caves and wore rags and survived on berries and roots. His clothes, though strange, were well made. His tower was sturdy and well maintained. The tower itself was the biggest puzzle. It was impossibly old, yet the fresh repairs, the new bridge railings, the well-maintained door spoke of a long-term presence. It looked like a military installation, a fortress of sorts. But the windows of colored glass were a luxury no soldier would possess. It was an outpost, she thought. It must be. An outpost for what? For whom? Watching what? The cold reality of her situation hit her like falling into icy water. He was none of the things she knew. He existed completely outside the world she understood. He had no social structure she could reference, no place in her understanding of how society worked. She had spent her entire life learning to read people, to categorize them, to know who was a threat and who was not. But she had no frame of reference for him whatsoever. The feeling of being so utterly lost in her understanding of another person was a new and terrifying kind of fear, different from the fear of hunger or cold or violence. This was the fear of the unknown itself. With a gentle push, Fenris opened the outer door. It swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a small, cramped antechamber with a wall of heavy cloth before them. He closed the door behind them, sealing out the cold mountain air. Then, with a practiced motion, he swept the cloth aside. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Moonlight streamed in from two impossibly tall windows on the far wall, their pointed arches filled with panes of colored glass. The light fractured and scattered, painting the wooden floor with shards of blue, green, and red. The floorboards were impossibly wide and long, each one a single plank that ran the full width of the room, wood that had no business being that size, from trees that no longer grew in any forest she knew. A massive table large enough to seat 20 men dominated the center of the room. A great stone fireplace stood upon one side, flanked by 2 benches that looked as though they could serve as beds. The walls were a silent testament to a life she could not fathom. Shelves were stuffed with an impossible number of things, vials of colored liquid, strange polished stones, and tools whose purpose she could not guess. But it was the books that drew her eye and held it captive. They lined the shelves in rows, dozens of them, bound in thick leather and stamped with ornate symbols and letters in scripts she did not recognize. She had never seen so many in one place. She had only ever seen 2 books in her entire life. A memory came unbidden, a conversation with a scribe she had met years ago when her father was still alive. The man had been working upon a single manuscript for his abbot, copying a holy text. He had told her with quiet pride that he had been working upon it for 50 years and was finally nearing completion. He had confided that the finished manuscript would be worth enough coin to purchase a small village. And this man had dozens of them, perhaps more than 50. He had a library worth multiple villages sitting casually upon his shelves like a peasant might have pots and pans. Who in all the hells was he? He was no lord, his wealth was not in land or people. He was no merchant, these were not goods for trade. He was no scholar from a great temple, his books were not filled solely with holy words. He had knowledge, wealth, and power beyond her wildest dreams, but it was a kind she did not recognize, could not quantify, could not understand. Fenris moved to the great fireplace and knelt, his back to her, bending to blow life into the embers that remained from an earlier fire. And then she saw the rest. The clutter. Everywhere. This was not a formal hall or a study meant for show. It was a workshop. Some plates sat unwashed upon the table. A tangle of dried herbs hung from the rafters. And every shelf was a jumble of objects, some she recognized as common pots and pans, while others were strange instruments of polished brass or crystal. It was a bizarre mix between a carpenter's workshop, a smith's forge, and a scholar's scriptorium, with papers, plans, and diagrams scattered across every available surface. It made no sense. None of it made sense. Fenris gestured to a place by the fire without looking at her. He then took a large, heavy knife from a sheath hanging upon the wall. The moonlight from one of the massive windows caught the blade, and for a moment silhouetted against the firelight with his wild, untidy hair, he looked like a madman from a dark tale. A fresh wave of fear coursed through her, cold and sharp. But he simply took a sack from beneath the table and poured out onions and other vegetables. He began chopping them upon one end of the vast table, and the sound of the blade upon wood was rhythmic, mundane, strangely comforting. The simple domesticity of it felt like a blasphemy. This table, surely meant for scholarly debate or grand feasts, was being used as a cutting board. The whole room was a contradiction that made her head spin. At one end of the table, chopped mushrooms lay drying. Beside them sat rough wooden bowls that looked like a peasant's simple things. Yet a few feet away, the finest silver vessels and ornate wine cups reflected the firelight with the quality of royal treasures. It was an impossible combination, a world of high and low mixed together with no regard for proper order. He was a man who owned a library worth villages and drank from silver cups, but cooked his own food and chopped vegetables with a blade fit for a warrior. He had no servants. He had no place in the world she knew. He was an anomaly that defied comprehension. The puzzle. A pot began to bubble over the fire, a rough iron thing that looked like something a hedge knight might use at a campfire, yet here it sat inside a royal fireplace adorned with carved dragons and ancient symbols. Fenris reached into a pouch at his side and, with a casual flick of his wrist, tossed something toward her through the air. It spun like a thrown coin, glinting in the firelight, a small, intricate object. Lyra caught it reflexively, her hands closing around cool metal and smooth wood. It was beautiful and bewildering, an intricate construction of polished silver and dark wood with tiny knobs, levers, and what seemed to be hidden hinges. It had the delicate, impossible craftsmanship of a master jeweler, something that must have taken months or years to create. Yet he had thrown it to her as casually as if it were a simple stone. She held it, feeling the weight of his observation upon her, a silent question in his gaze. This was a test of some kind. She had to make sense of it, to find its function, its purpose. Her fingers, which knew how to pick locks and throw knives with deadly accuracy, began to turn the knobs and manipulate the levers. To her surprise, the object responded. A small panel slid open with a soft click. A tiny, gear-like piece rotated with satisfying precision. As she worked, it subtly changed its shape, a puzzle unfolding in her hands like a flower opening to the sun. Lyra's confusion transformed into single-minded focus. The world narrowed to the object, to the intricate click of mechanisms, the smooth slide of panels. She did not notice when the scent of stew filled the room. She did not hear Fenris quietly ladle the food into 2 wooden bowls and set them upon the table. She was completely absorbed, a small human with a great problem, determined to solve it through pure will and skill. The warmth began slowly, creeping across her chest. The amulet at her neck was growing warm again, a soft, steady pulse against her skin like a second heartbeat. It was telling her something, she realized. It was telling her that the impossible object in her hands, her mother's necklace, and the man across the table were all connected somehow. This was no longer just a test. It was a mystery, and she had to solve it. "Thou art making progress," Fenris said, his voice a low rumble that cut through her focus like a knife. "But now, let us eat ere the food grows cold." Lyra's attention, so completely fixed upon the puzzle, was painfully torn. Her body craved the hot stew, a deep, gnawing hunger that felt like a living thing inside her. Her mind, however, was in a frantic quest, consumed by the need to understand the object in her hands. She felt an unconscious pull to solve it, as if it were a direct test of her worth as a person. She was also, she realized with a fresh wave of shame, being incredibly rude. She had not spoken a word since he had brought her into his home. She had barely looked at him. Common politeness required her to eat, to converse, to show some small gratitude to the man who had saved her from freezing to death. She made a compromise between her warring needs. She set the object upon the table beside her bowl, within arm's reach so she could glance at it. She picked up a wooden spoon, and her body blessedly took over. The rich, savory broth was a balm to her empty stomach, warming her from within. But even as she ate, her eyes kept darting back to the strange object, unable to let the mystery rest. The last embers of the fire glowed softly, casting long shadows across the cavernous room. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful, hungry sound that rattled the colored glass panes. Fenris went to one of the benches by the fire and laid out a thick, soft blanket with practiced ease. "Dost thou prefer left or right?" he asked, his voice low and casual. He gestured to the 2 benches as if this were a normal choice between equal options. The simple question made Lyra's racing thoughts stumble. He simply assumed she would stay, and she was so tired, so worn down by fear and cold and hunger, that her body accepted the offer before her mind could raise objections. "Come," he said, rising. "I shall show thee where the water is for washing thyself." He led her to a wooden partition in the corner of the great room, a simple wall that broke up the vast space. A door swung open to reveal a small alcove. A large basin of polished wood sat upon a stand, and a pitcher of water and a clean, folded cloth rested beside it. The water, when she tested it with her fingers, was already warm, a profound, impossible warmth that felt like a quiet blessing. Fenris looked at her clothes, now damp from the night's travel and stained with weeks of dirt and desperate living. "Thy garments are quite filthy," he said matter-of-factly, with no hint of judgment. "Thou must have others in thy pack that can be washed. These will never dry overnight. We can wash them in the same basin and hang them to dry by the fire." He paused, a question in his eyes. "I can only offer thee a white robe as substitute whilst they dry." His offer was simple and practical, but his robes, she knew, were the mark of his strange station, whatever that station might be. The white cloth was a stark contrast to her dark, grimy boy's clothes. Lyra accepted the robe without speaking. Her mind, so used to defiance and suspicion, felt only a deep, profound emptiness now. She was too tired to fight, too weary to run, too exhausted to maintain her disguises. The heavy, dark fabric of her traveling clothes felt like armor she had finally been given permission to shed. Fenris, with a quiet grunt of effort, slid a heavy iron bolt into place upon the outer gate. The sound was loud and final, echoing in the stone chamber, sealing them away from the howling wind and the dangers of the night outside. "I shall leave thee for the night," he said, his voice calm and clear. He gestured to a staircase carved into the wall she had not noticed before, steep and narrow, leading upward into darkness. "I will be in my bed above, upon the 3rd floor. If thou needest aught, call out and I shall hear thee." He pointed to the fireplace. "Start the fire again if thou growest cold, or when thou wakest in the morning. The tools are there beside the hearth, and the wood is stacked behind the bench." He paused at the base of the stairs and looked back at her. His eyes were kind in the firelight. "Thou art safe here, girl. No harm shall come to thee within these walls. Rest well." And then he was gone, his footsteps echoing up the stone stairs until they faded to silence. Lyra stood alone in the vast room, wearing a wizard's white robe that was far too large for her, clutching her mother's amulet, surrounded by more wealth and knowledge than she had ever imagined could exist in one place. And for the first time in 6 years, she felt safe enough to weep. The morning after, she woke to pale sunlight streaming through the colored glass, painting the floor with shards of impossible color. For a moment, she could not remember where she was. Then it came back: the fire, the tea, the tower, the wizard called Fenris. She sat up slowly, her body aching from sleeping upon the bench despite its softness. Her clothes hung by the fire, still slightly damp but wearable. She dressed quickly, suddenly shy about being in the white robe, though the tower seemed empty and silent. She found him outside upon a small platform of stone that jutted from the tower's base. He was standing perfectly still, holding his strange walking stick upright, watching something. She could not tell what. He stood thus for a full minute, then made a mark upon a piece of parchment he had weighted down with stones against the wind. Then he reversed the stick, pressing its gnarled end into the ground, and stood still again. He was measuring, just as he had said. Measuring things she could not see, recording things she did not understand. When he noticed her watching, he smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Good morrow, Lyra," he said. She started. He had used her true name, not Leo, not the lie, her real name, which she had not spoken aloud. "How didst thou?" she began. "Thy amulet spoke it," he said simply, as though this explained everything. "Well, not spoke precisely, but it sang thy true name when I touched it. The magic within it knows thee as Lyra, and so that is what thou art." He gestured to the tower. "Come, break thy fast with me, and then we shall speak of things. The tests begin." Over the next days she lost count of how many, for time seemed to flow strangely in the tower. Pattern emerged. Fenris would wake early and go about his measurements. She would prepare simple meals for them both, learning the routines of the strange household. And then, in the afternoons, he would set her tasks. The first was a sundial. Go outside, he said, to the cliffside where the willow grows. Thou wilt find stones there. Build me a sundial that can tell the hours. She did as he asked, though she knew not the proper way to construct such a thing. She tried to remember what sundials she had seen looked like, arranged stones in what seemed a reasonable pattern. It took her 2 days. When she brought him to see it, he studied it for a long moment. "What is this?" he asked. "A sundial, as thou didst ask. And what dost thou think it measures?" The hours of the day?" "Aye, but what is an hour, Lara? What dost thou think thou art measuring when thou measurest time?" She had no answer that satisfied him. He made her start again. The second attempt took 4 days. She studied the path of the sun more carefully, tried to account for the angle of the light. When she showed him, he asked her again, "What art thou measuring?" This time she said, "The movement of the sun across the sky." "Better, but still not quite right. Try once more." The third attempt took a week. She became obsessed with it, watching the sun from dawn to dusk, marking its path with careful attention. When she finally showed him, he nodded slowly. "Now thou art measuring not the sun, but thy relationship to the sun. The sundial measures not time itself, but the turning of the world beneath thy feet. Dost thou see the difference?" She thought she did, a little. Then came the leaves. One morning, he took her to the great willow tree upon the cliff and gestured to its massive canopy. "Count the leaves," he said. She stared at him. "All of them?" "Aye. Count them and tell me the number." She tried. Gods, how she tried. She spent days beneath that tree, attempting to count. She tried marking branches, tried counting small sections and estimating, but the wind would blow and leaves would shift and she would lose count. New leaves were budding even as old ones fell. The number seemed to change with each gust of wind. After a week of this madness, she came to him in frustration. "I cannot count them," she admitted. "The number changes constantly. Every day there are new leaves and fallen ones. Every moment they move and I lose track. There is no fixed number to know." He smiled at that, a satisfied expression. "And so thou hast found the answer." "What? But I did not count them." "No. But thou didst learn that some things cannot be counted, that the world is not fixed but flowing, that what seems like a simple question, how many leaves, is in truth impossible to answer because the answer changes even as thou seekest it. The right number of leaves is not a number at all. 'Tis a moment. 'Tis the truth of that day, in that hour, in that breath of wind. And by the time thou speakest it, 'tis already changed." She sat with that for a long time, her mind wrestling with the concept like a dog with a bone. The bowl. Then came the bowl. He handed her a simple wooden bowl one evening, smooth from years of use. "Fill this with silence," he said. She stared at him. "Whoa, silence?" "Aye. But silence is not a thing. It's the absence of sound. How can I fill a bowl with absence?" "That," he said calmly, "is what you must discover." She tried everything. She sat in the quietest parts of the tower, holding the bowl, waiting for what? She tried taking it to places where there was no sound, deep within the stone walls, into the supply cellar where sound seemed muffled. But there was always something. Her own breath, the beating of her heart, the faint rustle of her clothes when she moved. She tried to understand it philosophically. Was silence the space between sounds? The moment when one noise ended and another had not yet begun? Could she capture that moment somehow, trap it in the bowl like catching water? Days passed. The bowl remained empty. She grew frustrated, then desperate, then strangely calm. She sat one evening by the fire, the bowl in her lap, and simply listened. Not trying to capture anything, just listening. She listened to the crackle of flames. She listened to the whisper of wind outside. She listened to the silence between the cracks of wood burning, the silence between gusts of wind. She listened to the silence within herself, the quiet place beneath her anxious thoughts, beneath her fears and memories. The silence was not the absence of sound. It was the space around sound, the calm within the storm. It was a moment of peace, a quiet place she had not known she possessed. She held the bowl out, not to fill it, but as a place to contain this feeling, this moment, this understanding. When she showed Fenris, she did not speak. She simply sat before him, holding the empty bowl, and let the silence speak for itself. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have found it," he said quietly. The bowl was never to be filled. It was to be held as a place for the quiet you find within yourself. The question. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she finally gathered her courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind for days. "Why?" she said simply. "Why do you teach me these things? Why did you take me in? What is all this for?" Fenris set down the cup of tea he had been drinking. He looked at her with those ancient, unreadable eyes. "Tell me, Lyra," he said, "would you prefer a life defined by counting leaves or a life defined by finding silence?" She understood the question beneath the question. Would she choose a life of trying to measure and control the immeasurable, of imposing order on chaos? Or would she choose a life of finding peace within the disorder, of understanding that some things cannot be counted or contained? "I have spent my whole life counting," she said slowly. "Counting coins, counting days until the next meal, counting the hours until I could sleep safely. I am tired of counting. I want to learn how to find silence. I want to learn how to see the world as you see it." A slow smile spread across Fenris's face, genuine warmth that reached his eyes and transformed his weathered features. "Then you are fit to learn things of an unseen nature," he said. He did not say she had passed a test. He did not say she had failed. He simply stated a truth. The counting of leaves was not a test of your ability to be a merchant, but of your ability to see the difference between what is and what is not. The silence was not a test of your ability to empty a room of sound, but of your ability to find a quiet place within yourself despite the noise of the world. He stood and walked to the fire, stoking it gently with an iron poker. The light danced in his eyes like stars. "The way of things in this tower is simple," he said. "I shall teach you what I know. But your education will not be solely in the unseen world of magic and measurement. You will also do the household work, the cleaning, the cooking, the gathering of firewood. This too is part of the teaching. To understand the nature of hidden things, you must also understand the simple, honest work that keeps a home and a life together. The mundane and the magical are not separate. They are woven together like threads in cloth." He turned to her, and the look on his face was one of profound expectation. "If you wish it, you can become my apprentice. But you will work. You will learn. The path will not be easy, but it will be your own to walk. What say you?" The choice made. Lyra's breath hitched in her chest. Apprentice. She, a simple girl who had lived on the run, who had stolen and lied and hidden herself for 6 years, was being offered a chance at a life she couldn't have even imagined a week ago. Her heart screamed that she was not worthy, that she was a fraud wearing a white robe she had no right to wear. But her deepest desire, the one she had just discovered in the silence within herself, cried out that she had to accept. She had to try. She had to become something more than a ghost surviving day to day. She said, her voice thick with emotion threatening to spill over. I want to. I want to learn." The words felt like a promise and a prayer both. "I thank you for everything, for saving my life, for seeing me." The fire crackled. The wind moved through the colored glass.